We are joined by a very special guest, Dack Rouleau. Dack Rouleau is an independent journalist from New Hampshire, and you could find his work at overwritten.org. Dack Rouleau is well known for his coverage on the candidates, specifically asking all of the candidates for their stance on Julian Assange, and he has worked heavily with me on an article that I had published and is a main contributor to that piece. Dack has definitely been someone who has set the standard when it comes to questioning the candidates. So he and our co-host Christy were both just recently in Iowa, and I'm going to let them take over from here and explain exactly what happened, because I'm sure you did see that there was an incident in Iowa during the caucus. So thank you guys so much.
So I'm sure everybody is a little tired of hearing about Iowa, but we did have some people in the chat who really did want to hear our perspective and what was going on. We don't have very good news on as far as the results, still sort of pending, sort of finalized. I'm not really sure what is happening as far as that goes, but we did have an interesting time going to the caucus. The Iowa caucus is known for being a little disorganized, a little rowdy, and at times it seems like there's been a lot of stories out of Iowa over the years of people getting really intensely in each other's faces over these candidates, because the caucus allows people to vote multiple times, and a candidate has to have 15% viability in a precinct. And so when a candidate does achieve that viability, they get to then speak to the non-viable candidate voters and try to persuade them over, which sometimes is not, doesn't go over nicely. Our precinct, while it was located very shortly before the actual caucus day, luckily we found out in time, it was fairly organized, and I would say overall the attitude of people was pretty even keeled, at least at the beginning. It was I would say dominantly a Warren crowd and a Pete crowd at this precinct. Bernie's supporters were there very actively as well. Biden did not do so well in the precinct. I was involved actually caucusing while Dack got to walk around and observe, and he can pick up and tell you a little bit of what he saw and the interactions that he had with people.
Yeah, so I was hoping to see how people would interact with each other during the caucusing, how they were going to convince one another to vote for the candidate of their preference. And unfortunately, I ended up crossing paths with, I never did learn the gentleman's name. He claimed he worked for some division of the Iowan government, either Fish and Game or the Wildlife Reserve, something like that. But I ended up calling him the Bull Goose after what occurred on the caucus floor. We struck up a friendly conversation talking about the differences between Iowa and New Hampshire. And then we got on the subject of what I was going to do when I returned to New Hampshire. And I said I was going to vote for Tulsi Gabbard. He immediately asked me why I was, quote, voting for Putin, because like many of American adults, he has been watching way too much TV and has become convinced that Tulsi Gabbard is being paid rubles in order to stir up trouble here at home. When I explained to him that the reason I was voting for Tulsi Gabbard was because of her support for Julian Assange, he then accused me of being not only a paid emissary of the Russian government, but also a terrorist. We got into a discussion about that, about how Julian Assange is not a terrorist, but most of the people running for the nomination of the Democratic Party have actually committed terroristic war crimes, or at the very least have indicated that they're more than willing to do so once they take office. He ended up leaving to go back to the other side of the room, and then when he returned with a black magic marker in his hands, he proceeded to try to drag that over my hands to, quote, give me another Russian tattoo. I'm not sure which of the tattoos on my arm he thought was in Russian. He might have thought that this German tattoo was in Russian, or he might have thought that this French tattoo was in Russian, but I think what he actually thought was that this was in Russian. I know you probably can't see it very well. This is actually English that is upside down. So he probably thought that the English language was Russian from his perspective. And when he tried to drag that on my hands, I snapped the marker literally in half out of his hands. And that was when the ushers had to separate us. And he spent most of the rest of the night staring at me and making sexual gestures at me. And that's the kind of behavior that the Democratic Party encourages. And that was by far the most brutal response I've received for supporting Julian Assange out there in the real world.
Yeah, throughout my time caucusing, we and one other person caucused for Tulsi, and obviously with just two people, we were not a viable choice. So I started to try to court the other candidates' crews. I had an Assange shirt on, and so I went up to them, specifically the Bernie group, because they were a pretty solid group that was looking to be a viable candidate. And I asked them if they would encourage Bernie to stand up and say Julian Assange's name, and stand up for him and make a statement that I would consider him over to Bernie's side. I got a lot of stares and a lot of shrugs and yeah, sure. So I ended up going over to Yang's side initially for the very official first round. After it looked like Tulsi was not going to be able to stand to the other viable candidates. So yeah, it was a little frustrating. We did talk to the Amy Klobuchar people. We talked to the Andrew Yang people. We talked to Warren people about Julian Assange. I would say probably the Yang and there were a few Bernie people that actually the precinct captain for Bernie was very receptive to hearing what I had to say about Julian Assange. The Warren people were not. They really didn't have a response for us. And the Pete people really didn't either. At least I did not get any response, a good response from them. So it was interesting because as they are going through these rounds, a lot of the precinct captains go around to the undecided voters and ask them, what's your issue? Like, why did you like this candidate? What can I tell you about my candidate? So it was an interesting experience talking about Julian Assange and seeing how many people, the public that live in my neighborhood, in my area, don't know enough about Julian Assange. So yeah, ultimately, I believe Pete won my precinct. So, and of course, as we know, the vote between Pete and Bernie is Bernie won the popular vote, but Pete got the most delegates. And yeah, it was a very interesting experience, and especially that evening, as we expected to be able to talk that evening and record something about the results, nothing was coming in. And we started seeing reports about the app not working and the long phone waits for the precincts to be calling into. Yeah, it was, and as like Dack wrote up about, he was interviewed by RT and wrote his own experience on his blog. We've had a lot of people, of course, the Bernie supporters coming back to us saying that he did support Julian Assange. As I was live tweeting through the night, I had a lot of people tweeting at me that Bernie does support Julian Assange. And as we'll get into later into the show, we actually, Primo Nutmeg actually did an interview with somebody from the campaign, and they have not made an official statement.
No.
So there's a lot of misinformation out there on whether Bernie does or doesn't support Julian. And that was kind of interesting to see all those Bernie people not know who Julian Assange was. It was very disappointing, actually.
So Dack, why don't you go ahead also and explain further your experience, and then also what you wrote about, and maybe your contact with RT, and if you felt that it was perhaps your support for Julian Assange that may have led you to being targeted.
Well, it definitely was. Helen Biniski, you can follow her on Twitter at Velocirapture23, I believe. She was the one who wrote the article for RT describing what had happened. And what it showed was the person, the bull goose who came and grabbed me. I didn't really consider it assault, but what he was doing was, this is a person who has obviously been spending way too much time online and has been fed the Russiagate narrative for the last several years. And so he was in person with what he thought was an actual Russian terrorist here to wreak havoc at the Iowa caucuses. And so when he's face to face with that kind of foreign menace that he's been reading about in his political fantasy blogs for the last several years, he thinks that he finally has an opportunity to save the day and to defend the Democratic Party, and that's his way of doing it. He just obviously doesn't want to go all the way and actually get himself into trouble with the law by actually assaulting somebody. Now, on the campaign trail, I had 3 unique experiences where people became aggressive about my stance on Assange, and I noticed that each time they became more and more aggressive. The first time was way back at a country fair months and months ago. Some people, progressive supposedly, told me that they would not vote for Tulsi Gabbard if she was serious about dropping the charges against Assange. They said that they agreed with her on every other point, but if it came down to defending Assange, they would switch their vote to Donald Trump, which I thought was ideologically incoherent. And then a few months later, there was a Trump supporter who took an interest in Tulsi Gabbard, and he stood by the view that Julian Assange is some kind of international criminal and he deserves whatever he gets. Now, he and I got into a little bit of a verbal argument, but it never came to a physical point like it did in Iowa. And I think what we see is that these people who are buying into this Pentagon propaganda are becoming increasingly insecure as they get closer and closer to the dashing of their political dreams. They know that their candidates are not going to dethrone Donald Trump, and so they're looking to blame whoever they can. And like Julian Assange became the scapegoat in 2016, he's getting ready to become the scapegoat in 2020.